Edward got up from the waiting room chair, Clara trembling with fever in his arms. The words died in his throat. Before him stood Helen, his first childhood love. Her face was more mature, but her eyes were still the same. Her badge read, Dr. Helen Santos, pediatric immunologist. Edward, she whispered, dropping the clipboard she was holding. Time seemed to freeze in the busy corridor of St. Luke's Hospital. Edward felt his legs give way. 20 years had passed, but it felt like yesterday when she had vanished from his life without explanation. Daddy, it hurts. Clara whined, pulling them back to reality. Helen regained her professional composure in seconds, picking up her clipboard. Please, follow me to the office, she said, her voice firm, as if she wasn't seeing the ghost of her first love an hour earlier. Edward Miller was in his office on the top floor of the building that bore his name, in the financial heart of New York. At 38, he owned a real estate empire worth billions. But, at that moment, his phone rang with a call from Rose. Mr. Miller, Clara's fever has risen to 104 degrees. She's delirious, Rose informed him. Edward abandoned his meeting with international investors without explanation. In 20 minutes, his driver pulled up in front of his luxurious penthouse on the Upper East Side. Rose was at the door, Clara wrapped in a blanket. It's the third time this week, Rose said, handing the girl over to her father. The medicine isn't working. In the car, Edward held his daughter close, feeling the abnormal heat radiating from her small body. At 6 years old, Clara was all that remained of his marriage to Louisa, who had died 3 years earlier in a car accident. Edward hadn't been the best father since then, burying himself in work and leaving Clara's daily care to Rose. It's going to be okay, princess, he whispered, kissing her feverish forehead. Clara opened her blue eyes, so much like her mother's. Daddy, there are butterflies flying in the car, she mumbled, pointing to the empty space. Edward felt a chill. Hallucinations. The private pediatrician had already prescribed 3 different antibiotics in recent weeks, and nothing was working. At St. Luke's Hospital, one of New York's best, Edward went straight to the pediatric emergency. His name immediately opened doors. Dr. Santos is our best specialist for difficult cases, the nurse explained, leading them to a private waiting room. And then, the moment that would change everything, Helen walking through the door. The mutual shock and Clara between them, a bridge between past and present in the office. Helen maintained a professional distance as she examined Clara. Edward watched her every move, unable to process the coincidence. When did the symptoms start? Helen asked, avoiding his gaze. 3 weeks ago. It started with a low fever, then got worse. 3 different doctors, 3 different diagnoses, Edward replied. Helen nodded, focused on Clara, as she turned the girl's wrist to check her veins. She noticed a small crescent-shaped birthmark. Her fingers paused. That birthmark. Was she born with it? She asked. Edward frowned. Yes, why? Helen swallowed hard. Just checking. She flipped through the medical chart the nurse had brought, stopping at a piece of information. It says here that Clara was adopted. Closed. Adoption right after birth, Edward replied, feeling uncomfortable. Her biological mother died in childbirth. Everything was legal, if that's what you're asking. Helen took a deep breath. I'm not questioning anything, just ... Double quotes, she hesitated. I'll need to run several tests. Persistent fever with these neurological symptoms could indicate something autoimmune. Do whatever is necessary, Edward said. Money is no object. A brief flicker of irritation crossed Helen's face. It never was for you, she mumbled softly, but quickly regained her professional tone. I'll admit her for observation. The first results should be in within a few hours. As Helen turned to leave, Edward couldn't help himself. 20 years, Helen, you just vanished. She stopped at the door, her back to him. Now isn't the time, Edward. Your daughter needs medical care, not old stories. Helen left, leaving him alone with Clara, who had fallen asleep from the antipyretics. Edward ran a hand through his hair, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions. Helen was here, after all these years, with his daughter's life in her hands. At the reception desk, Helen leaned against an empty wall, breathing heavily. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. Of all the hospitals in New York, Edward Miller had brought his sick daughter to hers. And that birthmark, identical to her younger sister's, the same sister who had died in childbirth 6 years ago. The coincidences were too disturbing to ignore. The hospital room was luxurious, the best money could buy. Still, Edward felt helpless watching Clara sleep, connected to monitors and an IV drip. How can someone so small get so sick, so fast? He murmured to himself. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Helen, accompanied by a nurse. We need to collect more blood for specific tests, Helen explained, maintaining her distance. Edward nodded silently as the nurse attended to Clara. Helen reviewed notes on her clipboard, avoiding his gaze. Any idea what it might be? Edward finally asked. It's still too early to tell. Initial tests ruled out the most common causes. The silence between them was heavier than words. 20 years of absence, unanswered questions, a lifetime lived separately. You're different, he commented. Breaking the ice, Helen looked up from the clipboard. 20 years does that to people. The nurse finished collecting blood and left, leaving them alone with a sleeping Clara. Why did you never answer my letters? Edward asked, old resentment surfacing in his voice. Helen frowned. Your letters. I never received a reply. Before they could continue, the door opened again. A grey-haired man in an impeccable lab coat entered. Edward Miller, long time no see, he exclaimed, extending his hand. Dr. Paul. Edward stood up to greet him. I didn't know you still worked here. Paul Carter, now the hospital director, administrative director for 10 years. Paul smiled, before turning to Helen. Dr. Santos, can we talk for a minute in the hallway? Paul got straight to the point. Helen, I know you're the best for this case, but I also know about your past with Edward. This isn't going to interfere with your work, is it? Are you sure? Can I transfer the case to another doctor? No. Her answer was too quick. I mean, I'm already familiar with the case. It would be counterproductive to switch now. Paul stared at her, not entirely convinced. Just don't let the past complicate the present. Back in the room, Edward had fallen asleep in the armchair beside Clara's bed. Helen allowed herself to observe him for a moment. The boy she had known in Florida had become an imposing man, but with lines of worry that didn't match his eyes. The memory took her back to a simpler time. They were 10 years old when they met, children from different worlds who met by chance on a beach. Edward's father was a rising businessman, hers a fisherman. Despite their social differences, they grew up together. Teenage love blossomed naturally, lingering when Edward's family moved to New York and she stayed in Florida. He would return every summer. They promised to stay together after finishing school. Then came the scholarship to study in France, a unique opportunity for a poor girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor. She wrote, explaining the situation, pleading with him to wait for her or to come with her. She never received a reply. Helen sighed, returning to the present. Clara stirred in bed, opening her small blue eyes. "Hi," Helen smiled. "How are you? Feeling tired?" "Where's Daddy?" "Sleeping there." She pointed to Edward. "He's very worried about you." Clara looked at her father affectionately. "He works a lot. Rose takes care of me most of the time." "Rose, our housekeeper. She's like my grandma. Daddy says Mummy's in heaven watching over me." Helen felt a lump in her throat. "I'm sure she is." The following days established a routine. Edward managed his business by phone, refusing to leave the hospital. Helen made frequent visits to the room, always professional, but increasingly comfortable. In his presence, on the third night, Helen found Edward in the hallway, looking out at the city lights. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "I can't stop thinking I might lose Clara too." Helen hesitated before lightly touching his shoulder. "We're doing everything we can, I know." He turned to face her. "Helen, what happened to us?" She looked around, making sure they were alone. "I got a scholarship to study medicine in France. It was a unique opportunity, but it required me to work there for 10 years afterward. So, I wrote explaining everything, pleading with you to wait for me or to come with me. I never received a reply." Edward frowned. "I never received any letters. You just disappeared. I went to Florida to look for you. When, 3 months after you vanished, your mother said you had gone to Europe and didn't want any more contact." Helen felt her legs weaken. "That's not true. I wrote several letters, called your house many times, but they always said you weren't there." Understanding began to dawn on Edward's face. "My parents," he mumbled. "They never approved of our relationship. They thought you weren't suitable because you were a fisherman's daughter." Old resentment colored his voice. "They were from a different era, Helen." A heavy silence settled between them. "And your wife?" Helen finally asked. "Clara told me about her mother being in heaven." Edward swallowed hard. "Louisa died 3 years ago. Car accident. I'm sorry. We met in business school. We got married young. It was a good marriage." The unsaid hung in the air. "And you, did you get married?" Helen shook her head. "Medicine took up all my time." A nurse appeared in the hallway, breaking the moment. "Dr. Santos, the new results are in." Helen nodded, returning to reality. "I have to go." As she walked away, Edward called out, "Helen, I would have waited. Or I would have gone with you." She stopped, but didn't turn around. "The past is dead, Edward. We have to take care of the present now." But, as she walked towards the lab, Helen knew she was lying. The past was very much alive, breathing between them like an invisible third person. And with each passing hour, it became harder to maintain the professional distance she had promised herself in the exam room. Helen meticulously examined the latest slides under the microscope. There was something in Clara's white blood cells, a pattern she had seen before. "Dr. Santos, I'm sorry to interrupt," said a young resident, "but Dr. Carter asked me to let you know Mr. Miller is asking about the results." Helen sighed. "Tell him I'll be there in 15 minutes. When the resident left, Helen pulled a folder from a special cabinet. Inside were photos of slides almost identical to Clara's. The name on the label, Marina Santos, her sister. The coincidence was too disturbing. Helen had suspected ever since she saw the birthmark, but now she was almost certain. Clara was Marina's daughter, her younger sister, who had died in childbirth 6 years ago. In Clara's room, Edward was on a tense phone call. "Richard, I can't come back now. My daughter is sick." Edward, the audit found serious inconsistencies. Richard Silver, his partner and childhood friend, sounded urgent on the phone. "Millions have been embezzled. We need your signature to block the investigations." "What investigations?" Edward frowned. "What's going on at my company?" "Nothing we can't solve, but we need you here." Edward looked at Clara, who was drawing in bed. "No, my daughter comes first. Solve this without me." Hung up the phone just as Helen entered the room. "I have news," she said, serious. "We found the cause of the fever. It's a rare autoimmune condition. Clara's body is attacking her own nervous system." Edward paled. "Is it serious?" "It can be, but it's treatable if diagnosed in time." Helen hesitated. "The interesting thing is that it's a very rare hereditary condition. Hereditary, but we don't know anything about Clara's biological parents." Helen took a deep breath. "Edward, I need to tell you something, but not here. Can we talk in private?" In the empty conference room, Helen closed the door. "What's going on?" Edward demanded. "This condition is extremely rare, but I've seen it before." Helen ran a hand through her hair, nervous. "In my younger sister, Marina." Edward frowned. "I don't understand." "Marina died 6 years ago, during childbirth." Helen looked at him. "The baby was given up for adoption because there was no one to care for him. My mother had advanced Alzheimer's. I was in France." Edward slowly sat down, understanding dawning on his face. "Are you suggesting that Clara, the birthmark, the rare disease, the age, everything fit? I need to do a DNA test to confirm, but I'm almost certain Clara is my niece." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward looked at Helen as if she were a stranger. "Why would your sister give her daughter up for adoption?" "She didn't. She died, Edward. The child's father was married, never took responsibility. The social workers did what they thought was best." Edward was processing the information when his phone vibrated. A message from Richard. "Critical situation. I'm on my way." "It's a lot to process," Edward murmured. "I know, but we need to think about Clara now. I'll start treatment immediately." 3 hours later, Richard arrived at the hospital. Tall, elegant, with the confidence of someone who always had everything. Edward met him in the hallway. "What's this mess at the company?" Edward demanded. "Nothing we can't solve." Richard handed him a folder. "I just need your signature on these documents." Edward flipped through the papers, suspicious. "This looks like a transfer of assets. What's going on, Richard?" At that moment, Helen walked past in the hallway with test results. Richard paled when he saw her. "Helen, ... he mumbled, in disbelief. Helen froze. Her gaze alternated from Richard to Edward. "Do you two know each other?" Edward asked, confused. A tense silence fell between the three. "We met in Paris," Richard finally said, "many years ago." Helen's eyes narrowed. "Paris. Is that where you told me Edward had gotten married a month after I arrived in France?" Edward looked at Richard, who was visibly sweating. "What is she talking about?" Helen stepped forward. "Your friend showed up in Paris shortly after I arrived. He said you had moved on, that you were engaged, and that I should do the same." "Wasn't engaged," Edward protested. "I met Louisa almost 2 years later." Richard took a step back. "She was going to be gone for 10 years, Edward. I thought I was helping you, helping me." Edward's voice trembled with rage. You lied to both of us. Your parents agreed it was for your own good, Richard defended himself. They wanted you to take over the company, to marry someone in our circle. Edward lunged forward, grabbing Richard by the collar of his shirt. My parents were involved in this. Helen intervened, separating them. Not here. We have patience. Edward released Richard, breathing heavily. Get out of my sight and out of my company. I'm calling my lawyers. After Richard left, Edward and Helen remained silent in the empty hallway. All this time, Edward murmured, all these years lost because of lies. ... We can't change the past, Helen said softly. But we have a little girl to save now, Clara. Edward ran a hand over his face. How am I going to explain to her that you're her biological aunt? We'll think about that later. First, let's get her well. These are detailed instructions for Clara's treatment. Typical Helen, always thinking of the patient above all else. Paul explained. Edward took the envelope with trembling hands. Where is she? I can't say. She requested privacy. That night, as Clara slept, Edward opened the envelope. Besides the medical instructions, there was a handwritten letter. Edward, I understand your fear. If I were in your shoes, I might react the same way. I don't want to take Clara from you. She is your daughter in every sense that matters. But she is also my niece, my sister's daughter, who never even knew her own child. The treatment is detailed on the following pages. Clara needs continuous monitoring for at least 6 months. The disease can go into complete remission if we follow the protocol. Helen. Edward felt the weight of guilt on his shoulders. Out of fear, he had pushed away the only person who could fully understand what Clara needed. 3 days later, Clara had a relapse. The fever returned stronger. We need Dr. Santos, the nurse insisted. She understands this condition better than anyone. Edward was desperate. Where is she? I need to find her. I don't know, sir, the nurse replied. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. That night, Richard appeared at the hospital again. Edward was so worried about Clara that he didn't even notice his presence until he spoke. How is she? Edward turned. Furious. What are you doing here? I came to make amends. Richard seemed genuinely remorseful, and to return this, he extended a folder full of documents. What is this? Proof that your parents and I conspired to separate you and Helen. Letters. She sent call records, everything. Edward took the folder, incredulous. Why? Why are you showing me this now? Because I almost lost everything trying to follow in your father's footsteps. Richard shook his head. I don't want to live with this burden anymore. After Richard left, Edward spent the night reading Helen's old letters, passionate letters, explaining about the scholarship, pleading with him to wait or to go with her, letters that never reached his hands. The next morning, Edward did something he hadn't done in years. He went to his father's office. Old Mr. Miller, now retired, still kept a room at the company's headquarters. Son, what a surprise. How's Clara? Not so good. Edward threw the letters on the table. I want to know why you hid this from me. Old Mr. Miller paled at the sight of the letters. Where did you find this? It doesn't matter. What matters is that you and Richard ruined my life, our life. We did what we thought was best for you. That girl had no future, no connections, nothing to offer but her love, other than the life we could have built. His father sighed, opening a drawer. It wasn't just these. He pulled out a bundle of letters, still sealed with a French stamp. She kept writing for years. I never had the heart to throw them away. Edward took the letters with trembling hands. She's a doctor now, one of the best specialists in autoimmune diseases in the country, and she saved your granddaughter's life. What? The doctor treating Clara is Helen, and we found out that Clara is her biological niece. Helen's sister died in childbirth 6 years ago. Old Mr. Miller slumped into his chair, stunned. I didn't know. Of course you didn't. You were too busy controlling my life to notice fate's ironies. Edward left the office with the letters and a new determination. He needed to find Helen. Back at the hospital, Clara had worsened. Dr. Carter was worried. We need Dr. Santos. She knows this condition better than any of us. I'm trying to find her, Edward replied, desperate. No one knows where she went. Clara opened her eyes, weakly calling out, Daddy, I want the doctor with the pretty eyes. Edward held her small hand. I'll find her, princess, I promise. That night, exhausted, Edward found a drawing in Clara's coat pocket. It was a butterfly with a signature in the corner. For Clara, with love, Helen, and below, an address. Without a second thought, Edward ran to the parking lot. He needed to find Helen before it was too late for Clara and for them. The taxi stopped in front of a simple building on the outskirts of New York. No luxury, no ostentation. A working-class building in the Queens neighborhood, very different from the environments Edward frequented. Are you sure this is it? He asked the driver. That's the address you gave me, sir. Edward paid the fare and got out. Looking at the paper with the scribbled address, apartment 302, he took a deep breath and entered the building. There was no doorman, just a simple intercom. He pressed number 302 and waited, his heart pounding. Who is it? Helen's voice came through the intercom. It's me, Edward. A long silence followed. Helen, please. Clara's worse. We need you. More silence. Then the sound of a door unlocking. Edward walked up the 3 flights of stairs. Helen was waiting for him at her apartment door, wearing sweatpants and a simple t-shirt, so different from the impeccable doctor at the hospital. How did you find me? She asked, not inviting him in. Clara kept a drawing of yours. It had this address. Helen sighed, opening the door wider. Come in. The apartment was small but cozy. Books everywhere, a few photos on the walls. One in particular caught Edward's eye. 2 girls on a beach, holding hands. You and Marina? He asked, pointing to the photo. Helen nodded. The last summer, before she got pregnant. Edward sat on the sofa when Helen gestured. Clara has a high fever again. Dr. Carter can't control it. Helen crossed her arms. Why did you come to get me personally? You could have just called the hospital, because I needed to show you this. He held out the bundle of old letters. Richard returned the letters you sent me from France, and my father. My father kept all the others you kept sending. Helen took the letters with trembling hands. You never read them. I never received them until yesterday. A heavy silence settled in the small room. Helen opened one of the letters, recognizing her own handwriting from 20 years ago. I thought I had been abandoned. I thought the same thing. Edward approached. Helen, I'm sorry for doubting you about Clara. I was scared. Scared of what? Of losing someone else I love. The word hung between them like a confession. Clara needs you, he continued, not just as a doctor, but as family. She's already asked for the doctor with the pretty eyes 3 times. A small smile formed on Helen's lips. She says that all the time. Edward moved closer. Come back with me. For Clara. For us. Helen hesitated. It's not that simple, Edward. Dr. Paul made it clear that I can't be personally involved with patients or their families. Then we'll wait until she's discharged. But she needs to be discharged first, and for that, she needs you. After a moment that seemed eternal, Helen nodded. I'll go change. 30 minutes later, they were back at the hospital. Clara smiled when she saw Helen enter the room. You came back, she exclaimed weakly, but visibly animated. I came back, little one. Helen approached, checking the monitors. I heard that fever came back to bother you. It seems she just wanted you back, Edward observed. Helen worked all night, adjusting medications, checking tests. In the morning, the fever had subsided, and Clara was sleeping peacefully. Dr. Paul found Helen in the cafeteria. So you only came back for this case? Helen avoided his gaze. I'll officially request a transfer later. It won't be necessary. Paul sat across from her. Edward told me everything about your past, about Clara being your niece. He's a different man than his father. Paul took a sip of coffee. I was thinking, the Department of Research in Autoimmune Diseases needs a director with adequate distance from pediatrics. Helen looked at him, surprised. Are you offering me a promotion? I'm offering a solution. You can continue at the hospital without ethical conflict and still accompany Clara as an aunt, not a doctor. In the following weeks, Clara consistently improved. Edward reorganized his company, removing Richard from the board and implementing a full audit. He spent more time at the hospital and less at the office. Helen, now director of the research department, visited Clara as a family member, not a doctor. Their three lives intertwining more and more. On the eve of Clara's discharge, Edward found Helen in the hospital garden. Tomorrow she goes home. Yes, finally, Helen smiled. She'll need monthly follow-ups, but the worst part is over. I have a difficult question. Edward sat beside her. How do we tell her about being your niece? Helen reflected. She's only 6 years old. Maybe we can start by saying I'm a special family friend who will be around, and then when she's older, we tell her the full truth, that her biological mother was my sister. Edward nodded, taking Helen's hands in his. I have another question. What happens to us after tomorrow? Helen squeezed his hand lightly. Depends on what? On you being ready for something beyond medical consultations. He smiled. 20 years is long enough to wait, don't you think? The next morning, as they prepared Clara's discharge, the nurse handed Edward a letter that had arrived by mail. The sender was the law firm that had handled Louisa's will. That's strange, he murmured, opening the envelope. Inside was a sealed letter with the words, to be opened only in case of Clara's serious illness. With trembling hands, Edward opened the letter. Dear Edward, if you are reading this, it means Clara has faced a serious health problem. There is something you need to know. When we adopted Clara, I began investigating her biological origin, concerned about possible hereditary diseases. I discovered that her biological mother was named Marina Santos from Miami. I know you never wanted to know the details of the adoption, but I believe it is important now. Marina had a doctor's sister who could help if Clara ever needed it. Her name is Helen Santos. I tried to find her, but she was working in Europe. If Clara is sick, perhaps it's time to look for her. With all my love, even from the other side, Louisa. Edward slumped into the chair, stunned. Louisa knew all this time. She knew. When Helen entered the room, she found Edward in tears. What happened? Silently, he handed her the letter. Helen read it, equally shocked. Louisa knew. She tried to find me. It seems all roads led to you. Edward smiled through his tears. Even when we didn't know it. Clara walked into the room, dressed to go home, interrupting the moment. Daddy, can I go now? Edward and Helen exchanged a knowing look. Yes, Princess. The three of us are going home. As they left the hospital together, Edward realized that somehow Louisa had given her blessing for this new beginning. Life had strange ways of mending what had been broken. No, that's not how I imagined it. Edward ran a hand through his hair in frustration. They were in the hospital cafeteria 2 weeks after Clara's discharge. Helen rolled her eyes. You want to propose in front of the medical staff who cared for your daughter? Seriously, it's not just any proposal. Edward lowered his voice. It's our proposal, in the place where we reconnected. Helen observed the determination in his eyes, the same stubborn look as the boy she had known on the beach decades ago. Edward, we just reconnected. Clara is still recovering. Don't you think we're moving too fast? 20 years, Helen. We lost 20 years. He held her hands across the table. I don't want to lose another day. She sighed, feeling the familiar warmth of his hands. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to dive headfirst into this second chance. Another part, the rational doctor, urged caution. What if we waited a little longer for Clara to adapt to all this? She was the one who gave the idea. Helen's eyes widened. What? Edward smiled. She asked when the doctor with the pretty eyes was going to live with us. She said she wanted you to be her new mummy. Helen's heart tightened. In just a few weeks, Clara had carved out an immense space in her life. Not just as her biological niece, but as the sweet, smart girl she was. I don't want to replace Louisa. No one is asking you to. Edward lightly squeezed her hands. Clara understands, in her own way, that Louisa is in heaven, but she also understands that you are special. Helen considered everything that had happened. Louisa's letter seemed like a blessing from beyond, as if fate had elaborately conspired to mend what had been broken 20 years earlier. I'll think about it, she promised. 3 days later, Helen was surprised by an urgent call to the pediatric floor. She rushed, thinking it was some patient emergency, only to find the hallway empty except for Clara sitting in a wheelchair, holding a bouquet of daisies. Clara, what are you doing here? You were discharged. The girl smiled mysteriously. It's a surprise, Aunt Helen. It was the first time Clara had called her aunt. Helen felt her eyes well up. What surprise? Clara pointed to the end of the hallway. There, in the exact spot where they had reconnected weeks earlier, stood Edward, wearing the same suit from their first day, holding a small blue package. What's happening? Helen asked, approaching. We're exactly where it all began again, Edward said. Where fate corrected a 20-year mistake. He knelt, eliciting gasps from the nurses Helen now realized were strategically positioned to watch everything. Helen Santos, I already lost you once, and I won't risk losing you again. He opened a small box, revealing a delicate ring. Marry me. Clara approached in her wheelchair, offering the daisies. Please, Aunt Helen, can we be a family? Helen looked at the two of them, the man she could never forget and the girl who was her own flesh and blood. The coincidences, the discoveries, the bridges rebuilt between shattered pasts. Yes, she replied simply, with tears in her eyes. Yes, to both. Edward stood up and embraced her, lifting her off the ground as the hallway erupted in applause. Dr. Paul, who was watching discreetly, just shook his head with a resigned smile. "You planned all this?" Helen asked when he set her down. "Me, Clara, and half the hospital," Edward confessed. "Even Dr. Paul helped by having you come to this floor." Helen knelt to hug Clara. "So you approve, little one. You make Daddy smile." Again, the girl replied simply, "And you make my butterflies go away." Helen hugged her tightly, understanding that butterflies was Clara's way of referring to her illness symptoms. In the following months, life completely reorganized. Edward sold the Upper East Side apartment, considering it too full of past memories. Helen left her small apartment in Queens. Together, they bought a house with a garden in Greenwich Village, a new place to start fresh. The financial press made a small stir when widowed millionaire Edward Miller announced his engagement to renowned immunologist Dr. Helen Santos. Some speculated about financial interest until they discovered that Helen had refused any prenuptial agreement, insisting on maintaining her professional and financial independence. At the company, Edward implemented profound changes. Richard was completely removed, facing lawsuits for attempted fraud. Miller Holdings reoriented part of its investments towards the healthcare sector, funding research into rare diseases. Daddy's building a new hospital, Clara excitedly told them during dinner. A research center, actually, Edward corrected, for rare autoimmune diseases. Helen paused her fork in midair. "You didn't mention that. It was going to be a surprise," he smiled. "I thought of calling it the Marina Santos Institute." Helen felt a lump in her throat. She would have liked that. "And you'll be the scientific director," he added. "I will, if you want. No nepotism, of course. The Scientific Council has already unanimously approved your name." Clara watched the exchange with keen eyes. Aunt Marina is in heaven with Mummy Louisa. Helen and Edward exchanged a glance. They had begun to gradually explain the family history to Clara, adapting it to her understanding. "Yes, darling," Helen replied, "and I'm sure both of them are. Very happy that we're all together." 6 months after the proposal, on Clara's 7th birthday, they finally moved into their new home. Rose, the faithful housekeeper, insisted on moving with them, officially becoming Clara's grandmother. On the eve of the wedding, Helen found Edward in the garden looking at the stars. "Nervous?" she asked, sitting beside him, "just thinking about how we got here. All the coincidences, the encounters and missed connections. Sometimes I think Marina planned it all from above." Helen smiled. She was always stubborn when she wanted something, like Clara. Exactly like Clara. Edward took her hand. "I still can't believe the doctor's office I randomly contacted for the adoption had a connection to Clara's biological family, and that her adoptive mother tried to find me years ago. Louisa was always very disoriented." Edward looked up at the sky. "I think in some way, she blessed us." Helen rested her head on his shoulder. "We're building a strange family, aren't we? A little girl with 3 mothers, a biological one she never knew, an adoptive one who left too soon, and an aunt who became a stepmother. The perfect family for us," he replied, kissing her gently. The next day, they married in an intimate ceremony in the garden of their new home. Clara was the flower girl, proudly carrying the rings. Dr. Paul attended as a groomsman. finally accepting that some rules can be broken when fate insists so strongly. As they danced under the garden lights, Edward whispered in Helen's ear, 20 years ago, on that beach in Florida, I was sure we'd be together forever. It seems I was right. I just didn't know how long forever would take to begin. Helen smiled, watching Clara dance with Rose under the stars. Some stories just need more time to be told correctly. The journey that began with a desperate father bringing his sick daughter to the hospital finally reached a new beginning. A widowed millionaire, a dedicated doctor, and the girl who unknowingly reconnected them. 3 lives that fate insisted on intertwining, proving that some loves are too strong to be forgotten, even when the world conspires to tear them apart. Tell us in the comments what part of this story touched your heart the most. Like the video if you believe that one moment can change everything. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories that inspire and move you. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that appearances can be deceiving. Because here, every story proves that even the smallest act can change a life forever.